My name is Amy Roon, and I've had the privilege of knowing Elizabeth Dilley for over 10 years, probably going on closer to 15. And so it is my privilege to introduce her to you this morning. There is out there a list of all of the Reverend Elizabeth Dilley's accomplishments, and you can read them. They are vast and many. She has a whole educational background you can read about. That's not the Dilley I'm going to tell you about, because I knew her in her first year of seminary. I had already been at PSR for, I think 2 years, actually. I was taking the 4-year plan through the 3-year program. And so our time overlapped perhaps even more than it could have. And I have always been, unfortunately, the kind of learner who hates to learn in public. And I had just started some fledgling gospel choir that really, really depended for my leadership and trying to remember how to do this. And I think in our first year, if we had 5 people show up, it was like, whoa, look at that, what a good choir. And my expertise, as many of you know, is in music, and I'm constantly calling. My ministry requires and desperately wants folks who are willing to change their story. And I don't want the experts. I mean, they're nice, but what's the point in teaching a choir full of experts about music, especially if you're spiritually inclined? I mean, what are we serving? I want the whole people of God. And Dilley was one of the first, sorry, we all call her Dilley. I think you're welcome to do that there, right? I still do that. Dilley took a look at her own profile and her own self in her first year in seminary and noticed that apparently you'd have to do some singing if you were going to be a pastor. And that was not part of her story. In fact, part of her story was being told, please stop. just don't. And so Dilley came, and I think your first words, you sat right in the front, because that's what she'll do. And she freely admitted and said, I just heard, I know this is something I have to learn, and I have to learn something about it. And somebody told me this was a safe place to do it. So I'm here. You teach me. And what I have to testify with, and many of us know, is that that's what our ministry requires, doesn't it? It requires people who are willing to live out their vulnerability in public, to acknowledge it, to show up, and to be partners even in their most vulnerable places. That's the Dilley I hope you know you see. And in the midst of all the accomplishments and where she is today, that she knows quite fully and retains, even as she comes here by herself with her almost 1-year-old child, which I can also attest to is an act of grace and living out your vulnerability in public. That she knows of what she speaks. She knows what she's asking you to do. And she knows what she's asking your parishioners and those who know nothing about the church. She knows what it's like to show up and not have all the answers and work through them together. I'm very excited to have all of you fall in love and enjoy Elizabeth Dilley as much as I have. Wow, thank you. First, I didn't think I was going to be able to speak because
Ben's story, the story that he related about Bill McKinney. Bill McKinney was the president of PSR when Amy and I attended, and I almost couldn't speak for about 2 or 3 minutes as Ben was telling that story. And I had a copy of it. I knew what was coming, and I still just, it's so amazing. And then that, where I can, thank you, and thank you, and thank you, Ben. Those words, all of those words, I hope you were all eating them up and treasuring them as much as I was, because they were so life-giving, so challenging, so wonderful. And that story that Ben opened with couldn't help but make me laugh, because there really are only a few arguments in the church, aren't there? That communion one, it still comes up pretty regularly. And then as for the carpet issue, I was actually warned about this in seminary. That and the color of the paint on the walls. People said, you know, your preaching can be mediocre, but people have lost calls over the color of the carpet. Of course, it's not really the color of the carpet, but that's another keynote address. So one of my favorite books is a biography called Sing Me to Heaven. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with it, but it tells the story of a man named Hyung-gu and his wife Margaret. They shared 4 years of marriage together, entirely in the midst of Hyung-gu's HIV positive status, his descent into full-blown AIDS, and his death. Margaret, his widow, writes luminously of their life together. She spares no painful details. One chapter has always remained with me. It is called A Green and Dying Tree. She describes how after a long, long period of discernment, in fact, her husband comes from Korean Pentecostals. And so, of course, for years, they've been pestering him to have a service of healing so that, of course, they could pray, lay hands on him, and he would be cured. Well, after a long, long, long period of discernment and this increasing decline, they ask their pastor to, in fact, lead a special service of healing. They don't really know what to ask for in this service, but they gather with members of their Bible study group and friends from the church and other places, and with church elders. There were many prayers shared that night, prayers for all kinds of healing. But Hyung-gu was not cured of AIDS. And yet, Margaret wrote, there's always an "at yet" when I speak. And yet, Margaret wrote, the service bore fruit in many ways. And here I'm quoting from the book. Hyung-gu got serious about writing down his childhood memories. Friends came together in new ways. And then this one other thing happened. This is where I'm quoting. Most fundamentally, those prayers for healing took place in the midst of a work of healing that was already underway. Bruce Cockburn sings, 2,000 years and half a world away, dying trees will still grow greener when you pray. Even as Hyung-gu died, he quickened. It was as if he were glowing. Every time he looked at me, all I could see was how much he loved me. And it made me feel he was not long for this earth. In a way as undeniable as it was mysterious, Hyung-gu was more whole when he died than he had been at any other time in his life. It was not the sort of healing that we had hoped or asked for. How could we have asked for it when we couldn't even imagine it? But it was real. More real than the shabby appearances that are so easy to mistake for reality. As real as new green leaves in a dying tree. Did you hear Ben say, when your mission is relational, you count the number of people dancing? I hope you heard that, because that right there, that's the future of the church. Now, at its best, it was also the church's past. Although we have as many successes and failures, the tally is sort of out about that, especially when we look with our postmodern eyes at what our Enlightenment brothers and sisters in faith did. But if the church, or at least its present form, is a dying tree, there are still some green leaves to show us present life, some ways to count who's dancing. And I'm going to share a few of those with you today. Perhaps you're aware that more than half of the churches in the United Church of Christ worship fewer than 100 people on any given Sunday. And that worship number, that's what we count now, not the number on the rolls. So if we believe that God is up to something in the UCC, the conversation has to include what God is up to in those churches. Ben shared a few of those stories, but often it's a conversation that I find missing in wider church settings, which kind of works in my favor, doesn't it? Because I'm here with you today. But on the other hand, it doesn't work in my favor, and it doesn't work in our collective favor. Because that's thousands of congregational stories that we aren't hearing. Like the church in rural Nebraska that holds a prom for the senior adults in their community. These are people who either live at home or maybe are living in retirement communities or even nursing homes. And one of the things that they long for is an opportunity to dress up, to feel handsome and beautiful again, to listen to the music of their youth and young adulthood, and to have their bodies share those dances they remember so well. One church in Massachusetts is known as the Pumpkin Church. They sell thousands and thousands of pumpkins in their little town. Pumpkins just emerge one day out of the back of a giant semi onto their great lawn, and people come and pick and buy, and all the money raised, while it would be so tempting to save it for their local mission, all that money goes back out into the ministries in the nation and the world. They also help and support other little congregations in the living out of their mission. I have a dreadful story to tell you about a church. A rotten example of a small church making a big impact on this world, in this case for ill. Do you remember Dove World Outreach Center in Orlando, Florida? Yeah, that's right. The Quran-burning pastor from Florida. Congregation he pastors worships about 50. His idiocy, if you want to be perfectly blunt about it, his idiocy and his utter lack of charity and disregard for basic human decency or the hearts of other human beings, Christian or not, sparked an international incident It garnered him months of free publicity. Now, why that didn't translate into exponential growth for the church that he serves, I can only attribute to the sanity and Christ-heartedness of the good people of Orlando, Florida. But imagine what it would be like if instead of someone like Terry Jones, who doesn't honor any of Wesley's rules for itinerant preachers, what if we had the ability, the audacity to make what we were doing in our daily lives known on such a scale like that? I mean, if Terry Jones, who's clearly not in love with God or God's people, can get that, surely we can do that. Here's one more forgotten story, forgotten ministry in our small churches. It's about one of my colleagues in Southwest Iowa. We'll call him Bill, but that isn't his name. Now, Bill, I want to paint you a little picture of Bill. And first I want to start by saying he has a really good heart. He does love God, and he does love God's people. But he's kind of an aging good old boy. He is not the most progressive man in any group except possibly Tea Partiers. He still persistently refers to gays and lesbians as homosexuals, even after being corrected repeatedly. He is the guy in the clergy group who will complain about the stiff-necked people in the church he serves. He loves to play what I like to call the Complain Olympics in our clergy gathering. I'm sure that the clergy in the room know this game a lot, and sometimes we get sucked into it. It's not the genuine venting, it's the one-upmanship of, oh, you think that's bad? Well, let me tell you about our rotten people. You know, our rotten people who I love, and couldn't you just imagine? Oh, God help me. I find the man insufferable. I know he has a good heart, but I find him insufferable. But a few months ago, he told us, he really genuinely opened himself up to us. He told us about this small and steady trickle of youth who've come knocking on his office door. The town he serves is even smaller and more remote, probably a bit more conservative than the town in which I live. These teenagers need to tell someone, anyone, that they're gay, or that they have a good friend who is, and they're really worried about him. These kids can't tell their parents. They sure as heck can't tell their own ministers. They don't even trust their teachers or school counselors. But somehow they've identified him, as a safe adult. Listen, the church he serves is small, middle of the road, small evangelical-ish, and largely patriotic. Good people, farmers mostly, largely elderly. I've given you my personal assessment of the man. How they learned to come to him, I have no earthly idea. But he is bearing their secrets in his heart. He is telling him it is okay. By his utter lack of condemnation, when he's certainly not out with a rainbow flag, but by the simple fact of not judging or condemning these young people, he is giving rural kids hope that God has not, in fact, forsaken them. He is telling them what we all long and mean to tell our young people. You are made in God's image. It will get better. Now, for his part, Bill is mystified by this. He doesn't know why these young people, sometimes they're dressed all in black, they've got the black nails. They don't know how they've latched onto him. He has no earthly idea what to do with the information that they've shared with him, other than offer a prayer that assures them of God's unrelenting love for them. And of course, to promise that he won't tell their parents. He won't tell their friends. He won't tell the principal. He doesn't know how this started or what to do with it. But can't we see that God has called him to this ministry of being a secret holder, a soul tender, and a wound healer? An unlikelier priest for this work you probably couldn't find. And yet, God has called him to that. I wonder what unlikely works we all might be called to in this day. Here in the United Church of Christ, we might be getting to that point where we're moving to an apartment and giving up our monastery. But if we focus on the things that we do well, that extravagant hospitality, that continuing testament, that radical love, that deep engagement with justice and equality, I cannot help but believe that whatever the future brings is a future in which God is ever more bright, ever more visible, ever more real, not merely in our congregations, but in all those that we serve. And I cannot help but trust that that number will continue to grow and grow and grow. For friends, what we have is better and sweeter and more hope-filled than anything that Terry Jones or the men and women of his ilk could ever think of offering. So what's going to happen here? I have no earthly idea. But it will be good because God is with us. And as Ben reminded us, God knows the plans that God has for us, for our good. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Amen.